are still waiting for just a few more people, but I'm going to go ahead and get started in the interest of valuing everyone's time who's on. Welcome to today's webinar. You can see the title there on the screen, but basically it's using unmanned aerial systems engineering and artificial intelligence in food production, and it's sponsored by GrowNextGen.org and the Ohio Soybean Council in partnership with educationprojects.org. My name is Jane Hunt, and I'm the Director of Education with Education Projects. Today, we also have Tom Fontana, the Director of Research and Education at the Ohio Soybean Council. Tom, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Jane. Really appreciate everybody participating today. For the past 25 years, the Ohio Soybean Council has worked with education projects to do all kinds of educational activities to help teachers and students in Ohio and around the country make the connection between science and agriculture. So we're really pleased to have you here today on behalf of Ohio's 25,000 soybean farmers and the Ohio Soybean Council. We're happy you could join us. We encourage you to use all the great resources at GrowNextGen, which is a partnership between the Ohio Soybean Council and Education Projects. Lots of good information and resources there. Go to GrowNextGen.org when you have a chance. And with that, I'll send it back to Jane. Thanks.
Well, we want everyone to know this is going to be an interactive session, so if you have questions during the presentation, you can type in the chat box to the panelists and participants. Alternatively, you may raise your hand, which should be a symbol at the bottom of your screen, and we can unmute you then and you can ask your question. Also, this webinar is being recorded and the link will be posted on grownextgen.org within the next few days. And with that, I'd like to introduce Chris Wiegman. Chris is leading today's webinar. He received his bachelor's degree in biological engineering with a minor in molecular genetics from the Ohio State University in 2016. He's currently in his third year of a PhD program under Dr. Scott Shearer in agricultural engineering. He's focusing on utilizing drones and developing novel sensor platforms for remote image acquisition. Additional research efforts include image classification with convolutional neural nets for automated stress diagnosis and wireless communication networks for sensor control and vehicle automation. And we're going to learn a lot more about that during his presentation. Thank you so much, Chris. It's all yours.
Well, thank you, Jane, for that introduction, and thanks, Tom, for those words. I really appreciate all the attendees for taking the time to come listen to me talk. So with that, we'll dive right on in. The first brief agenda, so we'll give kind of an introduction about myself and my academic track, and then we'll get into the research, so remote sensing for crop disease, focusing on layered sensing, intra-canopy sensing, 3D printing, and artificial intelligence, so kind of highlighting some new technologies that are really enabling a lot of innovation today. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with some kind of the importance of collaboration. A little bit about me. As I graduated from Elder High School in Cincinnati back in 2011, and all I really knew that I wanted to do was go into engineering. Outside of that, I didn't know. So I kind of started at Ohio State with biomedical engineering. However, I decided I didn't really want to study people. So I switched to plants with biological engineering during my sophomore year. And I picked up a minor in molecular genetics. I was kind of thinking I'd go be a gene jockey and work with one of the seed companies. However, when I went to graduate, there was a lot of consolidation in the industry. Bayer was buying out Monsanto, Dow DuPont were merging, and Chinachem was buying Syngenta. So I figured I'd, hide out in grad school for a couple years, and Dr. Shearer said there was space for me on one of his projects. So I originally started off with a master's. However, I was loving my research, so I switched to a PhD, and here I am. Kind of one of the big takeaways is just the importance of being flexible and being open to opportunities as they present themselves. When I graduated high school and even when I graduated undergrad, I had no idea where I would end up where I am. And so just kind of going with the flow and seizing opportunities as they present themselves. So with that, I feel like we'll get into the research that I've been working on. So first, we need to get some perspective on the problem, and that is to address kind of what is an image. How are we going from this collection of values into crop health? And so to kind of start off with that, focusing on what an image is, it's really simply just a measure of intensity of energy, of the energy contained here in the electromagnetic spectrum. So if you take a selfie on your cell phone or whatever, you're capturing the intensity here of red, green, and blue light. And a lot of people have heard of thermal cameras, and again, it's just the radiated energy here in infrared. So what we're doing is we're capturing this energy and then trying to back out crop health. We're trying to add that interpretation and add that value. So since we kind of talked about what an image is and that energy, it's time to get into how do we collect that energy and that data. And that's where drones come in. So I use this concept called layered sensing with unmanned aerial systems. And although unmanned aerial systems are not the only way to get crop health imagery, there are other remote sensing platforms such as satellites. They're what I focus on in my research, so I figured it's what I'd focus on here in the presentation. And so as it sounds, the Air Force Research Lab came up with this principle in the mid-2000s. And the idea here is you want to combine multiple platform scales and sensors in order to kind of leverage the strengths of each one. So in this application, I'm using a fixed wing here to fly the entire field to get a holistic assessment of the field, and then going back with a multi-rotor and additional sensors and focusing on specific areas of interest. So to kind of focus on fixed wing sensing here, the idea is, again, we want to get actionable information quickly. So fixed wing drones got longer flight times and higher flight speeds. So you can see here right now the platform, this is the Air Environment Quantix, is taking off, and then it's going to just fly a simple pattern back and forth across the field. Now the video we took this with is with a racing drone, so the video itself is not as stable. But again, the idea here is just to get that quick initial assessment as quickly as possible. And kind of at this point, I feel like I've paused and see if there are any questions from any of the attendees, or I can kind of talk about flying unmanned aerial systems in the agricultural space in part 107. So I guess since I'm not seeing any chats popping through, so one of the things with Part 107 is all drones have to be registered with the FAA, and it's a pretty simple process of just running through and registering online and paying a little $5 fee. Also, all flight operators have to have their Part 107 certificate. So that's just an in-person test at a FAA certified testing center, and study a couple days beforehand, and away you go. And that test is very important. One, so you know how to operate safely, but most importantly, so you know where not to fly. For the most part, the FAA and most pilots are not overly concerned with unmanned aerial systems. They just want to make sure you're not flying, say, near an airport or near a hospital or a helipad. So that's kind of my brief FAA overview in Part 107. The other thing I wanted to point out as that drone is going over is the nadir limitation. So that drone is limited to gathering data only above the crop canopy. And if anyone has walked through plant, cornfield, or soybean field, there's a lot going on underneath those top couple layers of leaves. So that's where my advisor and I got into this intra-canopy sensing concept. So the idea here is we want to try to get data inside the crop canopy and see what's going on kind of in the lower layer of leaves. And so that's where we come with this concept of intra-canopy, and it's very point to point. So we're going to very specific locations throughout the field to gather data. And ideally, this is kind of a crop scout's view of the data. So this is what you would see if you were walking through the field yourself. And we kind of see this as being the ideal data for stress diagnosis. In order to kind of get that, we designed what's called the Stinger. So the Stinger is pretty simple. It's a 4-meter fiberglass rod with wireless networking equipment pictured here at the top, right beneath the drone. You have a power supply as well as the sensor payload at the base. And this is what we're using to insert those sensors into the crop canopy. And kind of with that, here's kind of another video of the Stinger in operation. So right now, this is the kind of the pilot's view looking from the drone down onto the Stinger. So the pilot can use this view in order to place the Stinger kind of in the row and get the data it wants. And I'm sorry, Tom, for it being on the corn. It's just the clearest picture. So with this sensor, we're testing a spectrometer. So the idea here is to get a spectrograph of the chemical components in the leaf. So the sensor is going to grip the leaf, hold it steady in order to get the scan. So kind of at this point, also I'll pause and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, one of them is about how fast does the drone fly?
It's a good question. So the drone, the AeroVironment Quantix has got a cruise speed of around 40 miles per hour. However, according to FAA, the fastest you can fly legally is 100. But honestly, drone speed varies a lot depending on what you want to do. And so that's where you always have to balance. You know, the faster you fly, the more area you can cover. However, sometimes that can affect data quality. All right, so with that video, I'd like to focus a little bit on 3D printing. So all of the sensor heads that we work on, they're 3D printed. And so one of the really kind of cool things about this kind of new technology is, you know, this is really evolving over the last couple of years. And now in order to design and test a product or idea, you know, you don't need a multi-million-dollar fabrication facility. You just need a couple $100 and a little bit of creativity. Also, with all the open source resources around 3D printing, there's really a lot of capability you can do with all you need is just a little bit of time investment. And without 3D printing, a lot of this stuff with the Stinger would not be possible. So from an engineering aspect and then kind of from a practical do it yourself at home aspect, there's a lot you can do with 3D printing with a lot of the new technologies that are coming out. And the next one, the next technology, the next capability to talk about is artificial intelligence. And this is what we're using to process the data. So I figured I'd give a brief intro into AI. I know it's a really big buzzword these days, so I figured I'd discuss it pretty quickly here. So artificial intelligence was really inspired by and modeled after the human brain. So just like the brain has got, you know, billions or millions of connected nerve cells, neural nets are a series of connected nodes here. So you have data coming in, it's being processed by these connected nodes, and then you get outputs, ideally of desired behavior. And just like each nerve has got inputs and outputs, each node in the neural net is connected to all the others in previous layers and then linked through. And so to focus in on each one of these nodes has a weight associated with it. And these weights are kind of that form of long-term memory and storage. And so as, you know, data comes in and the net continues to process and train, these weights are then adjusted so the net learns what function you want to bring about in the desired behavior. So training these neural nets is a lot like kind of teaching a child how to pour milk. So when you look at the young gentleman here, yes, he did get a glass of milk. However, he spilled a lot. There's a lot of error in there. So as the neural net trains, you get better and you get to the young lady where she just needs to learn how to stop. And then eventually you get to the point where you get to the young lady here where she's nailing it. That's the exact behavior that we want. And then if you have enough data and you continue to train, ideally you get to this young lady here who is so advanced, she can now generalize her pouring principles from a completely novel container type, a different container type. This is kind of the idea here of what we're trying, of the behavior we want. And so to transition now to plants and diagnosing plant stress, we need training data. So the training data here is just, I've got several thousand images of leaves. And ideally, the neural net is going to learn the features in these leaves. So when we look at the leaves, we notice certain features. So for example, on the healthy leaf is pretty smooth and there is the absence of lesions or any different texture spots. And so I figured I'd ask the crowd here, if possible, if you could put in any features you've noticed kind of in looking at the different images. And Jane, I don't know if it would be easiest to read out if there are anything in the comments, or unmute people who raise their hands, or what you think would be easiest to do this.
I think if we just want to type in the chat for now, just what are the observations that you can make about the differences, right?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
So we have color differences. Edge.
Yeah, uneven edges, the textures, that's a great one. And yes, the color differences. So the color differences are lesions, and the other term for them can be chlorosis. So those are the features that say a crop science, agronomist would be using to diagnose these. And so ideally, the artificial intelligence, the neural nets, would learn these features. And so hopefully the slide, if it advances here. There we go. So this is kind of how ideally the convolutional neural nets learn these features in order to automatically diagnose some of the stresses. So you have the convolutional layer, and a convolutional layer is just a window of pixels here. And these window of pixels, they just go over the image repeatedly, and ideally they extract these features, whether it's the lesions, so those are kind of the spots on the leaf, and then, the size of the lesions, the colors of them, the orientation, all of these are important features. And then these form what are called feature vectors here that then get filtered on back to the hidden layer. These are the nodes that you all saw earlier, and these nodes will use that data to ideally classify the stresses, either, the biotic, the living stress, like a fungus, or the abiotics, like a nutrient deficiency, like a nitrogen deficiency. And so when it's kind of all said and done, ideally you have something like this. So as you can see here, this is an image taken from the stinger looking up, and then here would be the classification score on the output. And so we can see here that nice tan lesion with a purple halo, so we can be pretty confident that we do have frog eye leaf spot. So one important point I really want to make here is kind of the current state of artificial intelligence and supervised learning is, again, we have to train these algorithms on something. So these algorithms, they really cannot innovate yet. So really these algorithms, the idea of this project is not to replace anybody. It's to lighten the cognitive load, so to speak. So the idea here is, let's try to take one thing off of the farmer's plate. So instead of either the crop scouts or the agronomists having to spend time on these common, stresses like frog eye leaf spot, let's try to do that automatically so they can focus on the more difficult aspects of their operation. The other thing too I like to stress, especially when I'm talking to students, when it comes to artificial intelligence, again, it cannot be creative yet. It can't innovate yet. It can't problem solve. It can really only do stuff that is very repetitive and done every day. So that's where I always encourage students when they start looking at careers to make sure they look at careers where they have to problem solve, or they have to be creative, because that will be a job that will be there, for the foreseeable future. The next kind of enabling technology I want to talk about here are systems on a chip. So one thing that has really been instrumental in driving all this forward are these little computer chips here. So the most popular is the Raspberry Pi, first launched in 2012, and it's pretty cheap at $35. Now it's an extremely popular do-it-yourself chip, and there are a bunch of applications for these. I know some people are using them as a controller to run Netflix on their TVs. Other people are doing, like make-at-home security systems with them. So really, these chips, they're kind of beginning to replace like what you would originally need, a specialized miniature computer for a couple $100, or know how to program a microcontroller, which requires some prior experience and some specialized skill. And so with these little computers now, the ability to cheaply purchase computational power that you can put anywhere for a whole range of applications is possible. And even these systems themselves are evolving. So in 2019, NVIDIA released the Jetson Nano. Now this is a little more expensive, costs $99, but it's got a GPU that is specialized for artificial intelligence applications. And this is a kind of major upgrade to the Raspberry Pi. So to put this chip's capabilities in perspective here, I have this chart. So on the x-axis, you have these are different artificial intelligence algorithms. And then on the y-axis, you have this is inference performance in image per second. So this is how many classifications can this chip make with each one of these algorithms in image per second. And so can anyone here tell me quickly what is the average frame rate of most video cameras? So, if you're out recording with your cell phone, kind of how many pictures per second is your camera taking to get that video? And if someone just wants to type it in the chat real quick.
Anybody?
So one answer was 15, and that's a little bit lower. Actually, so the actual typical frame rate on most cameras is 30. And then yes, there are 60 frames per second for your really high-end cameras. I think most cell phones are around 29.9 or 30 images per second. So what I want to point out here is with certain architectures, this single chip can process upwards of 38 images per second. So that means that this chip for $99 can classify every single frame in a live video frame and a live video feed in real time. So kind of one of the points I want to drive home here is really modern capabilities are growing to a point where, all of this research really would not have been possible a couple of years ago. From a physical perspective with 3D printing, and then from a computational perspective, both from the algorithm side and from the hardware side with, the systems on a chip, the only limitation is one's imagination. There's a lot of capabilities we can do. And when you combine this with the open source resources available, really you can start cobbling things together and achieving things without a specialized education or experience. It just takes a willingness to try it and then dedicate some time to it. The last thing I want to talk to everyone here today is about collaboration. So I collaborate a lot with a whole bunch of people throughout Ohio State. And in fact, without their help, this research would not be possible. So I'm in FABI, Department of Food, Ag, and Biological Engineering, and my expertise is in drones, but it's not in production systems. So I therefore collaborate with a lot of other agricultural engineers like Andrew Klopfenstein to kind of get their experience on how to best apply any of this technology in a modern production scheme. Also, I'm not a plant health expert, so I collaborate with experts like Dr. Ann Dorrance, Dr. Pierce Paul, or Dr. Enrico Vanella to get their expertise on whether it's disease epidemiology, how the disease spreads, even where to find the disease on the plant. Their expertise is really instrumental. And also I collaborate a lot with OSU Extension. So one of the things I think that kind of separates Ohio State from any other research institution in the state is our extension services. So all 88 Ohio counties have an Ohio State Extension specialist. And these people are invaluable resources to kind of interact with the community, whether it's to test what I'm developing in the field or to visit fields, walk fields with farmers to get a feel for their operation. What problems can I help to solve? And people like Sam Custer and Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins have been critical. And finally, I collaborate a lot with computer science and engineering at Ohio State, most notably Dr. Jim Davis. I'm not an expert in computer vision or artificial intelligence. So again, being able to pick their brains and get their expertise is crucial. Most modern problems today are getting so complex that really no single expert will be able to solve them efficiently. It's really important to have a great deal of diversity, both in perspectives, background, and history, so that way we can come up with the best possible solutions to problems. Also collaborate a lot with Air Force Research Lab entities, the Air Force Civil Engineering Center, 3D Aerial, Air Force Research Laboratory, and then the Design Knowledge Company. So finally, to kind of get at some conclusions here. There we go. So one is to really be open to opportunities. We really don't know what's going to come our way, so we have to be able to seize those opportunities. The next is the huge benefit of modern technologies. 3D printing, artificial intelligence, and systems on a chip are really making a lot of things possible today that even 5 years ago would have been really difficult to design or achieve. And you combine that with the open source communities, and there's a lot that anyone can do just sitting at home playing around, as long as they have the patience and willingness to do so. And finally, again, the importance of collaboration is really, really important to solve modern problems. You know, the jack of all trades can become increasingly valuable to be able to communicate with all the different experts in all the different fields. And finally, no academic presentation would be complete without thanking all those who have made my research possible with their contributions. So, you know, Ohio Soybean Council has been instrumental funding me for the past several years, so I'd like to thank them, as well as the Technology Commercialization Office at Ohio State, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Air Force Research Lab. And so finally, are there any questions?
Yeah,
and so I see.
You see them?
Yep, I see some in the chat. So the one I see is, are there databases with where high school students can access and analyze data for independent research projects? And yes, there are. It just depends on your application. So the Imagenet Database is an open source database that has got pictures kind of everyday items, whether it's, you know, animals, cars, houses, that sort of thing. And that's something that can be accessed. There was one for plants called Plant Village. However, I believe they have recently taken it offline. I think they cited copyright issues. So for plant databases, I am not sure there are any open source ones for diseases, at least. Off the top of my head, I think there is one for identifying different plants. So like, is this a tree? Is it a flower or that? But I'd have to look deeper into that. Next question from Heather is, can you fly Stinger on drones when it is rainy or windy? And yes, when it's windy. I just have to be careful of how much wind I'm flying in. So I've had it up in like 18-mile-per-hour winds, but that was definitely pushing it. I figure I don't want to find that upper limit of what is too much wind. And raining, no, can't fly in the rain. 3D printing is very, very powerful. However, I have yet to figure out how to make it waterproof. And then the spectrum. So this spectrum is that how it works is it illuminates the target with a specific laser, and based on the emittance that comes back to the sensor, you can begin to figure out what chemical substances are in your target. So the idea here is you're just getting a very, very highly precise reflectance of a very specific spectrum. So it's like the electromagnetic spectrum back on the first slide. And the idea is we're trying to get a pre-symptomatic stress diagnosis with that one. And then Jane, are there any kind of questions I've been missing? Oh, a pilot's license. So you don't need a pilot's license. You do need a remote, it's called a remote pilot certificate. And yes, you do need one of those if you're going to fly for any commercial operation. Now, the FAA doesn't define commercial operation super clearly. However, like if you're going to go fly for class, then yes, you will need your remote pilot certificate. Or if you're, say, flying in any capacity to scout your fields, you'll need one for any kind of commercial application like that. But if you're just going out and flying for fun, is my understanding, you do not need a certificate. However, I would encourage everyone to get one. They're very useful for, again, knowing where to not fly and what to look for really with safe flying conditions. So I would strongly encourage everyone to get their remote pilot certificate.
One of the questions I have for you, Chris, is how difficult was it for you to get up to speed in agriculture after starting out as a biomedical engineer student?
I'm still getting up to speed, honestly, Jane. There's a lot to it. You know, the basics are the basics, you know, planting time, stuff like that. But I mean, it's an amazingly complex field the deeper and deeper I continue to go. And there's so many aspects to it. And also it's ever evolving. Even within the past couple of years, you know, standard procedure used to be you plant your corn first and then you plant your beans, but any more people are seeing that it's worth more to, you know, you plant your soybeans first and then get into corn. I mean, so it's always changing. And so I don't know, I think I'm still always getting up to speed. But I mean, I don't know, it's a really fun field to get into and to begin to learn. Not to be too discouraging, I guess. I don't mean to be discouraging with that answer.
Do we have any other questions from any of our participants or panelists?
There was one other question, Jane.
Yeah.
Is the spectrum like the spectral lines and stars?
No, so the spectral here, I'm gonna see if I can't zip back to that slide here really fast. So no, so it's just a very, well, I'm gonna end slideshow. No, so the spectrum here, what we're looking at is just a very, very precise reading in this spectrum here. So I'm using a specific NIR spectrometer, so we're focusing right in here. And what it does is it takes a very, very precise reading of the reflectance in, I want to say it's 12 to 1700 nanometers. So you're just looking at a couple of wavelengths in this region of the spectrum. And so that's where we've got a laser that is only emitting light in that region. And then based on the feedback, we're trying to figure out what substrates are actually in it. And yes, thanks, Jane, for that. Yeah, NIR is near infrared. So yeah, I see the question about how is NDVI for crop health monitoring versus disease detection. And I'd argue NDVI is great for health monitoring, but it's not as reliable for the precision needed for specific disease detection. So what you're doing with NDVI is you're just looking at, it's a ratio of reflectance of a couple very specific wavelengths in the red and near infrared region. And it's just a ratio of reflectance. So the idea here is if plants are photosynthesizing, they are absorbing red, but they are reflecting near infrared. And so based on that reflectance, you can then get at how healthy is your crop, how much is your plant photosynthesizing. And now a lot of research has gone into trying to reliably detect disease based on this ratio, but there's been very little success with it once it's deployed in the field with all of the, errors and scattering issues that come once you get outside of a greenhouse or a controlled instance. That's a very good question.
And one of the reasons why you're going into the canopy is perhaps because once it gets to the canopy and NDVI can detect it, it's already moved through the plant. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's just trying to get up closer to the plant. So when you're flying over the top, you're subject to a lot more atmospheric scattering, a lot more noise. So the idea here is let's get as close to the plant as possible and try to mimic that. If I was walking through the field, this is what I would see. So that's kind of the idea. Let's get as close as possible to it.
All right, and if there are no more questions, we do want to, here's a question about recommendations for thoughts for specialized crop sensors.
Yeah, so there are some, again, part of it depends on what you want to do. I think for starting out, RGB, your standard RGB cameras are really very, very useful. And then getting into some of the specialized ones, I think the Parrot Sequoia is a really nice all-around camera. It's really good for getting your specific reflectance values if you wanted to do NDVI, a vegetative index, but it also does have a standard RGB chip on it. So I think the Parrot Sequoia is a very good camera. It's a little expensive, but it's definitely one of the best all-around cameras. And it's one of the most flexible too, where you can fly it on the widest variety of platforms. The thing I'm beginning to notice is most of your camera systems are kind of very specialized and tailored to specific airframes. So, you can buy, again, Parrot Sequoia is one of the only ones, but for example, you buy a DJI drone, that sensor on that drone, you're not going to be able to fly it on, say, a EV SenseFly or any other platform. They're pretty tailored. And so really the Sequoias are the only ones I've heard that can work on a couple different platforms. But again, that's another very good question.
Yeah, I do want to mention that we know that there are probably some technical details that you might have to ask Chris, and he is a leader on GrowNextGen.org. So if you want to reach out through GrowNextGen.org, we can get information to him, and he can, we can get you connected if you have additional technical questions in addition to things about this webinar. So we do want to thank you for participating and joining us today. And just again, to remind you, there will be a link on GrowNextGen.org that will have this recorded webinar. So if you did want to share it out to any of your audiences, that will be available. And again, as Tom suggested at the very beginning, while you're there at GrowNextGen.org, check out the other curriculum and other things we have available there. So again, we do appreciate your attendance and look forward to seeing you at some other event. So have a great day.